Welcome to the Revolution Insight series. This particular episode is on the Mexican Revolution. I'll start off by saying this was a very interesting video, particularly, or a lecture rather, that this gentleman gave, and I highly recommend it. Very surprising, and in terms of the actual content of the revolution, just the events, the people, what happened during this particular period. It was very insightful in terms of the idea of what it actually was in to Mexican people in general. But the first note I got here is hard to get up from the under the U.S. thumb. It was the U.S. had their tentacles here in terms of course, they want to make sure that they have a pro-West, regime wherever they, and I mean all over the world, but especially when it comes down to our neighbors. Also, the idea of railroads here. There was mentioning of the railroads in relation to how it was an indicator of really how far capitalism has infiltrated. This is a very interesting point. I've noticed this in not in this particular series, but in another video I watched, in terms of the idea of when the U.S. first came, they started really building railroads. The railroads would come, and the Native American people really thought about it as, oh, these are, this is how they chase us away. This was kind of like the precursor to actual law enforced gentrification, basically. Another thing was another pattern here was a dictator that ordered, that basically not ordered, but a dictator that brought about order in terms of basically prioritizing it first before progress, and that's pretty huge when it comes down to dictators in general. Apparently they can't openly state that they're looking to crush all dissent in general because they want power for themselves and their friends. This is, something that it comes about through the idea of, this is order. We need order in this particular realm, and then we'll get everything that we promised. We just have to go through this small turbulent time. And it's a very, very interesting thing in general to see that play out in terms of see and recognize the pattern in general. But this right here was probably the most interesting insight. They had the longest commune, and this long before the Russian Revolution. And this particular commune was essentially, we're talking about people who were able to kind of live in a community like this, and essentially violate, the actual parameters. So I'm thinking about like kind of the opposite of special economic zones, where you have people living and they don't necessarily live in accordance with the idea of capitalism. They're living against capitalism, or rather they don't live in the idea of capitalism unhinged, as in special economic zones for the people who specifically made for the people who are very rich and well off. They live in a commune that's more worker centric, and these particular places, the idea here is that they kind of create a bubble in their own, in whatever country that they're in, and many times in terms of the special economic zone, it's opposite. It's just a polar. It's opposite, and honestly, it's more of a hellscape if you're a worker. But when it comes down to actual, the commune, it seems like just the idea of, it's a definite indicator, and it's something that I'm definitely going to take inspiration from in terms of moving and kind of in my own story in general. But in this other thing was, rich people, they had this thing where they would align with the peasants because their goals were aligned with them for this special thing. Or not rich people, but segments of rich people. They would align with the peasants and essentially, and ultimately betray them later on, right? So the idea here was like the rich people really do. They stick together to a much larger extent because it's so many more people who are peasants than the rich people, of course. And that was interesting to see. I definitely noticed that the economics and the importance of economics behind revolution in general. It's quite something to see that in terms of how it's almost always relies and is so heavily dependent upon the economics of the situation, and it's very much something when you're reliant on people who are really, they're just class loyal when it comes down to it. And this idea of Marxist ideology, this is something, I keep bumping into it, and I'm going to have to bite the bullet and really, read into it and study into it more and more, because this is something that keeps coming up. I'm not a philosopher by any means, but I do look at things, and I want to understand things, and I did so horrible in philosophy in college, but when it comes down to like the idea of people in a room talking, and I'm just turned off of the idea. I view philosophy as a whole bunch of people in the room who are just using big words to circle jerk each other, and I can't think about it like that. I gotta kind of bite the bullet and learn it. But it was kind of an inspiration here, and it kept being mentioned over and over, so I'll have to kind of pick up on that. It's definitely at some point. A big thing that drove this revolution was the idea of 95% of the land in Mexico was owned by 5% of the people. That is, it's huge. It's huge when it comes down to just the idea of understanding that something's not working, and we gotta really get through that in terms of understand that this is unhinged, like, and we do have to reach across classes in terms of the people who are poor versus the people who are working class versus the people who are that notch above working class, because I want everybody to understand we're all the same to them. You're much closer to many of the people who live in houses that you consider nice, in terms of you're actually a lot closer to them, and just an actual financial situation than either of you are to a billionaire, usually. Okay, unless you know some people, unless you're like really really next to some pretty nice housing, but you gotta be, or some really nice mansions rather, but you gotta really understand that, this is another note here too, because they had, essentially, labor was divided. They were able to essentially look at each other and be like, oh, there's this, it's like the labor people, the people who are in labor, they'll look at the people who are poor and look down upon them, and you kind of got to watch out for that. You definitely got to watch out for that. I've noticed this idea of there was a trucker and he was like yelling at a homeless person, and it was just like it was he told him to get a job and all these things. It was just like you got like a lot of animosity, and it's just like you guys, assuming that you're in the trucker protest that took place, or that you were involved in it in any way, you're one protest away from being on the street with this guy. So let's like let's be civil about our discourse and understand who's the real problem here, because we can't blame foreigners or blame a whole bunch of other people for what's going on. They have nothing to do with everything in terms of everything that's making life difficult in society, usually. Or not usually, all the time, or most of the time, I'll say. This idea also of two revolutionaries came about in this time period, and I thought it was interesting in terms of these two people and how they came about, and it was a whole story. Please look into this particular lecture. It was very interesting, but I'm not going to go into those two. But I think this idea of also, like, these guys, they had this there was a competency around military rule, but nobody really had a plan for the infrastructure development, or the maintenance, or the actual politics, or the actual politics, right? The politics that matters, right? Not what these people in our Congress do, right? Where they get up and they're just essentially they're putting on theater in our Congress, and in most situations, honestly. And the idea is, they kind of have to go through a filter mechanism where they have some kind of compromise on them, and that's what I believe, at least, that in terms of actually having any genuine power in society, any genuine power to change society. And I honestly do believe it's a genuine network, and I think there's some overseas action that's taking place as we speak that kind of attests to that. And it really does show us that. Also, the idea of transportation was important, and it is important. There's a few things that are important in terms of just in general when it comes down to revolution. Transportation being a huge one in terms of this Mexican revolution, in terms of I believe it was the railroads, or just the roads in general. This was a time where roads were just being developed, and it was kind of a more primary way of, kind of movement thing, or kind of a more predominant, or basically it was more focused on the roads and the railroads. And at some point, the revolutionaries that came up, one of them understood the importance of transportation. That was very huge. And also, this idea of political leaders in this time period, this is so crazy, but we do gotta kind of recognize that political leaders, in this lecture, he talks about this, the political leaders who are really too moderate, they're rarely successful. Like the guys who are trying to appease both sides, they're not really successful. They just kind of end up hanging out in the middle of the road, and they get ran over. That's kind of the idea. And you need to understand that's our political leaders, if they're radical in one way or the other, if they're radical Democrats, or what we have now in terms of the radical Republicans, you need to understand they're not going to make life better. They're really not in a lot of cases. And the idea is that usually radical Democrats are, the only thing they know is that they are opposition to the Republicans, and vice versa, in general, right? That's the most radical you're going to get, is being heavily against the other side. It's not going to be it's not going to be a movement that is going to be class based, right? You don't have a like Republicans versus Democrats. I think there's minor components of class in terms of in general, but that differentiation is really what they wedge. How you know, people like the Koch brothers wedge themselves into the Republican movement, as if, you know, the workers who catch cancer and, you know, are poisoned in their factories aren't, you know, as if it matters if they're Republican or Democrat. You know what? Like they're both going to get denied any type of health care as long as you can weasel out of it. You know, like we got to kind of realize that there needs to be a very class-centric approach to any type of radicalism in terms of political leaders to truly make real change in terms of political leaders, but also just the people in general, right? We got to stop looking for like one leader. We got to start really getting into the idea of an entire populace changing and forcing transformation, because we're not going to have that one savior. But in general, for those that don't know, I am doing this particular series to kind of give insight on, you know, what I'm kind of learning about revolution, and also you know, in terms of actually so you guys get insight into really the ideology that goes into this particular work that I'm creating now, that is going to really be in the form of a one-shot at first, but it's a whole world, so it's going to build, and it can build across multiple media outlet, in terms of it can be an audio story, it can be an actual and, you know, a manga series, of course, and it can also be various other methods like actual books, like movies, things like that. Those are kind of as it scales out, and that's kind of the whole plan. But in any case, this has been the Mexican Revolution. I hope you enjoyed it. If anything, hope to see you next time. Thank you.